Welcome to Sharpe Insights, Conversations with Your Plan Giving Experts, a podcast for development professionals. Whether you're new to the field or looking to enhance your existing program, we will provide practical tips, expert advice, and real-world stories to deepen your understanding of plan giving. If you're committed to securing long-term support for your nonprofit, you've come to the right place.
Welcome to Sharpe Insights, Conversations with Your Plan Giving Experts. I'm your host, Grant Miller. As someone who loves a good dialogue, I'm especially excited about today's guest, Dr. Russell James, professor of personal financial planning at Texas Tech University and one of the nation's leading experts on charitable giving. Dr. James has published more than 150 works on philanthropy and behavioral economics and is frequently cited by outlets like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Chronicle of Philanthropy. In this episode, we'll explore Socratic fundraising, using the right questions in the right order to help donors discover their motivations for giving. We'll talk about making the connections that foster significant gifts, the power of appreciative inquiry, and the quote-unquote magic questions that turn conversation into action. Dr. James, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So for those of us who either it was many decades ago or we slept through our Western Philosophy 101 course, what do you mean by the term Socratic, and how does that fit into your overall methodology here?
So the idea is, of course, we're asking questions, but Socratic methodology is asking questions in a way that helps the person discover the answer that is important to the conversation through their own reasoning, their own thought process. So it's not just a matter of asking questions to ask questions. It's almost like the idea of asking questions that is a bit of a guiding sage who comes alongside and helps a person to discover what is particularly meaningful for them in a philanthropic context. Of course, we see it throughout history, whether it's Socrates or Jesus loved to ask questions, or all sorts of philosophers love to go through that process. We actually find it's really powerful. One financial advisor I know puts it this way. He said, if you make a statement, well, that's just a matter of opinion. But if your client makes a statement, that's a matter of fact. And so we ask the questions in order to elicit the facts from the perspective of the donors.
So the initial idea was that the knowledge was somewhere inside of us. It just had to be sort of coaxed out through questions and through dialogue. Is that?
Exactly. So it's actually something beyond just gathering information, right? So part of the reason we ask questions is we want to fill out the form or we want to get the information. But even more powerful than that is helping the donor to go through that thought process of what is important to them. How are their values or their life story, how are their important people connected to this cause or this organization? What sort of an impact would be most meaningful to them? Having them go through that process actually makes it more important. It makes it more meaningful, and it makes them more committed to accomplishing those goals that they have personally discovered, rather than those that we just try to sell to them.
Thank you for that. I remember my son was about 4 or 5. He played the why game a lot. And eventually you get to a point where you are kind of at a standstill. And you're like, that's as far as this goes, as far as I understand. But let's start with the why here. What does your research show about why donors make transformational gifts? And does that differ, or in what ways would it differ from what fundraisers and plan giving officers often assume?
So I think it's helpful to begin with a simple distinction, and that is the distinction between small pocket change, disposable income gifts and big major life investment gifts. Those tend to be asset gifts. There's a difference in what motivates those two kinds of gifts. I've heard it put this way: small gifts are made to an organization, but big gifts are made through an organization. So the idea is this: if you want to go out and take the hard sales message that says, hey, I'm going to tell you how wonderful we are such a great organization, we are the heroes, give us money. Well, that's a small gift message. That'll get you the pat on the head gift, the isn't that nice for you people gift. The big gift message is fundamentally different. In that message, the organization is not the hero of the story. Instead, the organization is kind of like the hammer of Thor. You're a powerful instrument of impact, but the hammer of Thor is not the hero. It's amazing, but it's just the hero's powerful instrument of impact. So what we're trying to do is to talk to the donor about picking up this powerful instrument of impact to use it in order to accomplish the donor's own goals. So that's a little bit different story. It has a different main character, that's the donor, and it has a different role for the organization. By the way, in that story, the fundraiser plays an important role. That's the role of the guiding sage who comes alongside the prospective hero to challenge them to leave behind their small self-focused world and instead go on an adventure to impact the larger world. This is the role of Obi-Wan Kenobi in the original Star Wars, or Morpheus in the original Matrix, or even Gandalf the Grey in The Hobbit. It's a universal story, but it's a different story character role when we're talking about major life investment gifts.
Thank you for those examples. I was kind of going through my brain trying to conjure something. The first one that came up was Ben Kenobi. So those are those are helpful
Great.
as analogies for sure. So the fundraiser takes on this sort of guiding sage role, and I would say uses what you have phrased appreciative inquiry, right?
So that's another more modern term for Socratic inquiry, but it is a great term because it gives that sense of how we approach these conversations with genuine interest in that person's life and values and motivations.
Okay. So if I was new to a plan giving team and I was going to employ appreciative inquiry when talking with the donor, how might I prepare for that? Or is there a set of criteria that I could keep in mind when approaching a donor? Or do you have any advice on that? And if I were to come to you and say, how can I go about engaging in this appreciative inquiry?
Well, let's start with the idea of the goal. The goal is to understand your role. And that role is to say, I'm here to help the donors. I'm here to help the donors define and accomplish their most personally meaningful philanthropic goals. Hey, maybe it involves my organization, maybe it doesn't, but I can help them on their journey for that most personally meaningful philanthropic goals. Now, by the way, I am an expert on my own organization, so I know what it can do and what it can't. I really understand it as a potential instrument of impact. And so for those parts of the donor's goals where there's alignment, I can certainly let them know about how my organization can be part of that. But if we come at this from the perspective not of sales, I've got a product, listen to me sell this product, but from the perspective of I'm here to accomplish, to help you accomplish what you want to accomplish, what is most personally meaningful, well, we'll get into much larger conversations that lead to ultimately these big life investment gifts, not the small pat on the head, go away gifts, the big life investment gifts.
So less the late night commercials asking for money and more just really deep engagement with our potential donors and helping them explore what their legacy might be, right?
Exactly. It's the idea of we want to be there to help them accomplish their most important philanthropic impact, something that truly reflects who they are, their values, their life story, their important people. And so actually, we need to start there, talking about their personal values, their life story, their social values from important people in their lives. Now, this means asking questions to help you see those connections and ultimately understand what could be the most personally meaningful impact for the donors. So that's exactly the kinds of conversations that we want to have, that we want to motivate the donors, that they are going to accept this challenge. They're going to go on this journey, if you will. Why? Because of who they are, because of their identity, which comes from their values, their life story, and their close people.
So yeah, to sum this up, fundraisers traditionally focus on, I guess, the ask, like you were saying, asking for money or convincing a donor to give. And this strategy, would you say it just helps a donor discover why they want to give?
Yeah, now we're still guiding that process. So ultimately, we are still going to lead to a challenge that is hopefully of a substantial life investment kind of a gift. And that's the same role where we want to make that challenge to go on this potentially costly but important adventure to make an impact on the larger world. So we're not just sort of having these conversations in the air to build rapport. We're trying to elicit these values connections, these identity connections, so that we can begin to make those connections of understanding, oh, which part of the organization should they get more involved with? Which kinds of projects are they going to be most compelled to get involved with, to potentially fund? And so we are having these values conversations, but it is part of the fundraising process to lead to that ultimately motivational challenge or ask that we might lead to. But here's the difference. I've heard it phrased this way from really effective major gifts fundraisers, which is to say, I don't ask people for money. I ask people to do good things that happen to cost money. There's a difference there, that we're asking people to accomplish personally meaningful goals and showing them ways that they can do that, perhaps using our organizations as an instrument of impact. And that's a lot different from just asking for money.
So when I was teaching, we talked a lot about this concept of open-ended questions, as opposed to questions that are just require a yes or a no or a simple answer. And we do that to kind of dig into this Socratic dialogue or this appreciative inquiry. Are there any specific questions that you would advise people to think about when asking, or any, I guess, quote unquote, magic questions or anything like that that you could point us in the direction to?
Sure. So, what I would suggest is that rather than a magic question, but I'll give you some examples of great questions, there is a magic journey. And there's only three words you need to remember to understand that journey. And that is identity, challenge, and victory. Those are actually story elements. We begin with how the donor's identity is going to motivate their acceptance of the challenge. Now, that challenge isn't going to be just an ask for money. It's going to be a challenge that promises of victory. And that victory is going to be personally meaningful because it is relevant for the donor's identity. So identity, challenge, victory, back to identity. That triangle or cycle, if you will, that's what our questions always need to be advancing. And so how might we do that? Well, identity comes from values and life story and close people. So, for example, if I'm trying to help you understand your values connections, maybe I'll say, what inspires you to give? What inspired your first gift? I might even ask about, tell me about a few other causes you support. Why do you support them? We might ask open-ended questions. What is your connection to our mission or our organization? Or why do you give to this organization? What led you to do that? We're always trying to elicit that first connection between their identity and the challenge. We could ask about people. Have others in your life also been affected by this cause? Is there anyone in your family who has cared about the cause? But we can ask about their own life history. When did you first get interested in this cause? Would you mind telling me how you became connected to our organization? Now, all of these questions are trying to make that first link. What is the link between their identity and the challenge? Now, the second set of questions are a little different because we're actually trying to help them to define a personally meaningful victory. In other words, what philanthropic impact is going to connect back to their identity. Now, we could start broad with these questions. Hey, what changes do you believe would make the world a better place? Or how would you like to make a difference in this community or in this world? I really like questions that I call the no limits questions. If there were no restrictions on you, what would you like to do philanthropically? Or if you could do anything for this organization, if the sky was the limit, what would that look like to you? Or if money were no object, what would you like to see happen with our program? Now, the reason we're asking these questions is we want the donor not to be constricted. Just blue sky. What would be amazing to them? Well, that then starts them thinking and helps us to begin thinking about what at this organization is going to be most powerful to you. We could start out with those organizational specific questions. If you could change anything to better this organization, what would it be? Or what are your long-term hopes for our organization? That's fine as well. But again, although there could be 100 different ways we could ask these questions, we always need to keep in mind just those three connections. We're trying to connect the donor's identity to the challenge that we will make. It will be their motivation to accept the challenge. And we're trying to help them define that most personally meaningful victory, because that's what's going to compel them to want to go on that journey, to accept that challenge that promises the hope of that personally meaningful victory. I know I threw a lot at you there, but if you just remember identity, challenge, victory, that's what guides all of these conversations.
No, that's great. That's really helpful. And I think that approaching donors using that cycle could be really effective. I'm curious about appreciative inquiry and how it is applied to plan giving, where motivations and timelines, and, we're talking about estate plans and ultimately person's legacy. We're thinking about mortality and things like that. How do you apply appreciative inquiry to these, sorts of tougher subjects to talk about? Or can you speak to that?
Sure. So one of the things that we know about the estate planning, estate giving, is what is particularly powerful in that space are things that reflect the donor's identity, that have a sense of permanence. So for example, back when our exemption levels were lower in 2007, 2004 IRS data, 78% of all charitable bequest dollars went to private family foundations. Now, notice the identity connection. This is something that has my name or my family's name, that lives forever, that has to follow my rules forever. It is sort of the ideal identity continuation instrument. Well, in the same way, even that 22% that goes to public charities, it tends to go to public charities that are replicating these same features. These are well-established organizations that offer professorships, scholarships, endowments, funding a favorite part of operations. That's what big gifts look like. Now, that's not to say all estate gifts are big gifts. A lot of them are just, well, I'm going to name 10 organizations and you're one of them with a small pat on the head gift. That's not where the money comes from. The money comes from those major life investment gifts. So how do we move a donor from I've named you with a small gift and my will, to actually making one of these big life investment gifts? We start with the question. Well, thank you so much for including us with a gift in your will to treat us like a family member. That means so much to us. Let me ask you, have you ever thought about how you would like that gift to be used? And they might say, oh, just whatever's most helpful for you at the time. Well, the reason I ask is this. I was working with another donor. You kind of remind me of him. You both care about many of the same things. And he actually spent his career helping other people get their finances in order. And he recently signed a will that one day will create a permanent endowed professorship named for his family so that there will always be somebody doing research in that field. Now, those start at about $2 million, and I didn't know if that so that was a bit more than you were thinking of? Well, a lot of people in your situation like to consider starting a scholarship fund. You can start a name scholarship at a price. Okay, you see what I'm doing here? I'm actually trying to move the donor through questions to the kinds of impact that we know empirically is what will drive those major life investment gifts. What? How? By asking them about the impact that they want to make with the gift. In other words, helping them to define a personally meaningful victory. Those same kinds of questions are what we're going to use in that estate giving space to help them to define that big, hairy, audacious goal, and then show them the instruments that actually help them accomplish that goal.
Wow, that's great. That's really insightful. I'm just curious. I think a lot of people who work in nonprofits have a tendency to kind of always be in sales mode. Are there any, I guess, you mentioned identity challenge, victory. Are there any other little ways that we can just maintain a level of self-awareness that we're not slipping into sales mode? Or are there any telltale signs from donors that we might be, maybe shutting down a little bit or decreasing engagement or, because I know a lot of donors, they want to remain anonymous or they're really kind of trepidatious about what they want to do. Because essentially, if they're going to leave your organization and their estate plans, they have elevated you to the level of family, basically, like you mentioned earlier with the foundations. So anything to look for there in either that relationship or our self-awareness, how we're engaging with donors?
I think one thing is really important to keep in mind, and that is this fundamental idea. The most important and motivational story for me is my story. The most motivational story for you is your story. The most motivational story for the charity administrator, it's the charity administrator hero story. So this is the challenge, because if we are sharing a donor hero story with our internal audience, our charity administrator audience, it's not going to be that compelling to them. If we are sharing a charity administrator hero story with the donor, it's not going to be that compelling to the donor. So we need to understand that we are standing in between two different worlds that are operating with their own separate hero story narratives. And it's a bit like understanding we've got to translate. It's like our internal administrators speak Russian and the donors speak Japanese. And so we're going to have to flip back and forth and translate what works for the different audiences. So for example, if I'm talking to a charity administrator, I might say, well, you've already budgeted to spend money on these different categories. So if I get a donor to make a restricted gift to cover that expenditure, that's the same as unrestricted dollars for you. So I'm trying to recast what is important for the donor's narrative in a way that is acceptable to the charity administrator. Or I might come to them and say, I'm working with this donor. They want to set up this fund that accomplishes these things. Now they can do that on their own through maybe a community foundation or their private foundation, but I'd rather they give that money to us so that we manage it. What do you think? Well, notice what I've done there. I've now recast this for the charity administrator as not a fight between the charity administrator and the donor over control of the donor's money, but actually as a competition between our organizations and competing organizations over managing what the donor wants to do. So I just say that because here is the fundamental reality. When you are trying to get, say, copy approved from your internal administrators. If you write administrator hero story copy, they will love it and they will approve it. And that only works for the small gifts. What works for the big gifts is the donor hero story. And so recognize that that's true, but you might have to translate depending upon your audience. When we're working with donors, hey, how do we know that we're not slipping into the sales? Just ask the story character role. What role is our organization playing in this conversation? Am I trying to sell us as the hero, or am I trying to sell us as a potential instrument of impact that this donor might choose to pick up to use to accomplish their goals? That helps reframe these things. And if you want to get even more powerful, am I willing to do something which maybe the charity administrator wouldn't like so much, but is super powerful in a fundraising context, like to suggest to a donor to give later or less or differently? You see, if you do that with a donor, it's going to shatter that salesperson stereotype. It's going to put you more along the lines of that guiding sage that says, hey, I'm here to help you accomplish your goals along this journey by what? By providing magical instruments. Now, maybe that's a lightsaber. Maybe I teach you Kung Fu in 5 seconds, or maybe it's a plan giving instrument that helps you accomplish your philanthropic goal. Or maybe it is a gift agreement that sets up an endowment to accomplish what you want to accomplish. It's all the same story character role.
Well, I kind of wish we could add teaching Kung Fu to our resumes in 5 seconds.
It usually, yeah, if it only takes 5 seconds, I'm all about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's really great advice as well. But what if we do get off track with the donor? And I write a lot of donor stories, and oftentimes the donors will just kind of disappear during the revision process. And, are there any strategies for, I guess, reestablishing conversations with a donor who has maybe disappeared for a while or gone dark, or you're not sure, still has intentions to work with your organization? Any advice for approaching those situations?
Yeah, so in those situations, I think it is often helpful to lead with gratitude. For example, I might call you up and say, Grant, I was looking at our records here and was looking back at a gift that you made. It was actually 5 years ago under a different presidential administration. And boy, that was actually right in the middle of the world of COVID and all of that. Man, things have changed since that time. And I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to do that and to make that kind of an impact, and be happy to talk to you about the kinds of things that your gift has accomplished along the way, and just to see how you are and what's been going on since then. Right. So again, what I'm starting with is a couple of things there. One, I can start with gratitude, but notice I'm starting with your identity. I'm starting with your life history, something you've done in the past that defines you as someone who supports this cause. And I'm trying to begin from there, and you might then respond to that. You know the organization I'm working for, so maybe you're going to continue that conversation with connections with what has happened along the way. The other thing, if I was working with a donor for, say, donor stories, and we'd started on it, and then we're doing the revision process, if I am able to contact them again, what I'm going to do is emphasize the power of what they're doing. So I start with gratitude. Hey, let me just say thanks again for your willingness to allow us to share your story. I know it may not be the most comfortable thing for you, but it is so powerful in motivating other people to make these kinds of commitments. It's honestly like a second gift to the organization when you allow us to share this story to motivate others. So thank you for that. By the way, I had a couple of questions just to make sure we're doing this in the right way. Okay, so notice again, we start with gratitude. We start with their identity. This is the kind of person they are. This is what they are accomplishing. We're talking about their identity, and we're talking about victory. It's not just I'm asking for your help for a story. It's I'm asking for your help so that you will accomplish this personally meaningful victory.
So this has been really, really helpful and very insightful also. And I just really appreciate the idea of that we can consider being less, salespeople or people who convince people to donate. And I just really love this metaphor of the guiding sage. It's a great metaphor. It's a great image. And I think it's something that will stick with me and the trilogy here of identity, challenge, and victory.
Well, Grant, I have to say that if you're interested in that sort of thing, I've written a book that's freely available called The Epic Fundraiser. If you want the paper version, that's on Amazon, but the PDF is free at encouragegenerosity.com. Or if you just connect with me on LinkedIn, I send you links to all of my fundraising books for free.
There you go. And you said that's called The Epic Fundraiser?
Yeah, The Epic Fundraiser at encouragegenerosity.com. Or you can obviously buy it at bookstores, that sort of thing.
Sounds good. I'm sure it's very insightful and probably a really good follow-up to this episode. We'll have to have you back on sometime and dig in a little bit deeper to this and other topics. It's great having you here and really grateful for you sharing your expertise. And thank you, listeners, for listening to Sharpe Insights, Conversations with Your Plan Giving Experts. If you found today's episode helpful, please subscribe and share it with your colleagues in the field. Until next time, I'm Grant Miller. Thanks for listening. We hope today's discussion gave you practical takeaways to grow your plan giving program. To submit questions and topics for future episodes, go to sharpegroup.org or listen to us on your favorite podcast app. If you found this podcast insightful, be sure to like, review, and subscribe. Until then, stay sharp.